anti-Semitism.
Great job, thank you. See, you're in a school and you're gonna get quiet. That's a good sign. Can everyone hear me in the back? Everybody okay? Good, all right. My name is Avi Barron-Monroe, and I am the head of school here at Community Day School. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. We're delighted with the turnout and the interest. Thank you so much for coming. 2 years ago, our school, Community Day School, was named a partner school in the Facing History in Ourselves Innovative Schools Network. That was done in recognition of our school's leadership in social justice, human behavior, and Holocaust education. Facing History in Ourselves is an internationally regarded society and human behavior curriculum and program that inspires us to organize our educational program according to a simple but consequential proposition. People make choices. Choices make history. With this statement as a guiding principle, we empower our students here at Community Day School to confront bigotry in all its forms, and as a Jewish day school, particularly to confront anti-Semitism. It starts early with relations among friends in the classroom for 3-year-olds, and the education and lessons spiral by middle school to a deep understanding of race relations, world history, the Holocaust, and genocide. Last year, for the first time, this curriculum included a day on, not off, for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. On that day, our entire school engaged with the question of what it means to be an upstander and how to live out Dr. King's dream in Pittsburgh in 2016. Our students are actively challenged to connect their learning of history with lessons for today. If you haven't already seen it, please check out our Keeping Tabs sculpture at the top of our campus as you leave tonight, corner of Beechwood and Forward. It is a student creation inspired by their study of the Holocaust and is designed to confront each of us with the impossible and unforgettable visual of what 6 million looks like, and to remind us viscerally that then and now and in the future, every single life counts. As some of you may know, the Talmud is the central text of Judaism. It notes that the reason the second temple, the holiest site of Jewish people, was destroyed at the hands of the Romans in the year 70 CE was due to what we call in Hebrew, sinat hinam, or baseless hatred. From that standpoint, very little has changed in the past 2,000 years. We all still have the capacity to hate, but we also have the capacity for ahavat hinam, unbounded love. It is that capacity for unbounded love that has brought us all together tonight. This extraordinary turnout speaks to our extraordinary times. One woman on Facebook shared our event yesterday, recognizing that many of us, and especially parents of young children, are struggling right now for guidance on how we can be positive and proactive in meaningful ways. This is about being good humans who raise good humans, she said. With that, I welcome you all to Community Day School and look forward to learning with you this evening with an open mind and an open heart. And now I'd like to introduce Aviva Lubowski, Education Chair of the Community Day School Parent Association, who will greet you and introduce our guest speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Avi. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. If there was ever a time to gather to listen and learn about the topic of race and social justice, this is certainly it. We are all here because we have kids in our lives who we want to see grow into responsible, respectful, and empathic advocates for human dignity of every individual and group. As Avi noted, last year, CES began a a major initiative to discuss and educate its students about tolerance and activism by introducing the word upstander and spending Martin Luther King Day in school with an entirely different curriculum for every single grade. They were learning what an upstander, what it means to be an upstander. A person who sees wrong and acts. A person who stands up for their beliefs. A person who is not a bystander. And so, taking the lead from the teachers and administration here, who started the ball rolling, having very deliberate conversations with our kids about race and social justice, the CDS Parent Association was ready to continue these conversations. I know I speak for many parents when I say how proud I am, and this is not a plug, but a very genuine feeling. How proud I am that this school is intentionally and creatively pursuing ways of talking to our kids about diversity and the role we all play in upholding the dignity and opportunity of every individual. In Judaism, there's a well-known quote from the Mishnah in a section that details the Torah's views on ethics and interpersonal relationships. In Hebrew, Lo alecha halacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. It is not for you to complete the work of repairing the world, but neither are you for you to desist from it. So tonight is a piece, a big piece of that work that we can each do. How to teach our children. It is a privilege to introduce Dr. James Huguley, Assistant Professor at the Center for Race and Social Problems at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Huguley's research focuses on psychosocial interventions that promote racial equality and positive developmental outcomes. He is the principal investigator for the Just Discipline Project, focusing on racially equitable approaches to school climate and discipline. He is also a former youth program director and a middle school teacher. Dr. Huguley received his bachelor's degree in English and secondary education from Providence College and his master's degree in risk and prevention and doctorate in human development and psychology from Harvard University. He has an 18-month-old and another one on the way. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Huguley.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I didn't know when I signed up for this that it was going to be a couple weeks after the elections. And that the election was going to turn out as it did. So, as I mentioned earlier, I do not have all the answers, but we will have some interesting discussion points. I'm really excited for community-based school and what's happening and what the movement is here around understanding and ideas that are promoted in Facing History. I'm actually familiar with Facing History. When I was in grad school, my advisor, Bob Selman, took all of his advisees over to Facing History. This was, I think they were headquartered in Boston then. And we learned a lot about what they do. And that framework is an excellent space to start to have these conversations about race and about difference and about facing history and understanding history, and which I'll talk a good amount about tonight. My voice is a little hoarse, and if you know me, and at least one of my students is there, which is cool, then you know that my voice is always a little hoarse. It's not, I'm not sick, I'm nervous, but that's not why, so just bear with me in that regard, and sometimes I have to talk a little slow, so, but I will try to be riveting to make up for this. Quick overview of the presentation, and so I'm going to give you a little information about who I am, and I'll talk a little bit about the Pittsburgh Parenting Project, which is, I think, why I was thought of to come out and talk about race and parenting, and the tasks of racial justice parenting. I had to think about what does it really mean to raise our children as racial justice advocates, and I thought about a series of tasks that I think are essential, and we can talk about how to accomplish them. And then how to keep learning. I think what I will emphasize tonight is learning is key. We cannot transmit what we don't know, what we don't have. And so learning about these important issues is going to be paramount to doing things well with our children and in our communities. So, a little background. Former African American adolescent, and it's not because I'm not African American anymore, okay? I still am, but I'm not an adolescent anymore. But when I was, look at this stud. Small little guy. The funny story behind this picture is that this is like at the end of a football game where we lost like 45-0. You look at me and it looks like I was really out there giving my all. I was a bench warmer. I don't even know how my face paint ran. It must have been warm that day. So, but it is a good picture. I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. And I grew up in a rough neighborhood. Basically in the housing projects there in Providence. A lot of the things you think of when you think of rough neighborhoods. And I lived with my mom. My dad didn't live with us. He was in my life, but he didn't live in our home. And, at some point, my later childhood, he lived in another state. He was active, but, there was some limitations. My mom was a social worker and, raised me in the house. And I think that social working instinct really helped us because she was really thinking about filling the gaps. And, just a plug for the Pitt School of Social Work, we really think about how to maximize people's potential. And I thank her for that. Much later in life, my mom adopted a boy and a girl from foster care, and at one point, when they got to be adolescents, how teenagers can be, it started to be a lot for her. And so I moved home and helped her take care of them for a few years and served as a father figure for them. My mom was a single parent with these two teenagers, and so I came in and helped with that. And so before I had children of my own, this was my only legitimate claim to parenting in my life. But it was important. And so these background factors are important because when I got to college, I did think about the plight of my peers and why, I was able to get out of our neighborhood, but really I can count on one hand how many of us went to college and finished from my neighborhood. And we're in a school, we're pretty sympathetic to young people. And it was just kind of, when I sat back and thought about it, it's kind of devastating to see all that lost human potential. And so that really started me on my career trajectory. So as an undergrad, for a while I wanted to be a hip-hop journalist. That was my first idea. My dad was not fond of that. He said, look, get a teaching degree, so he said, if you don't make it in journalism, which you probably won't. No, he was encouraging, but you'll have a practical fallback. And so I was like, great. So going into my senior year, I needed a summer job, and I took a job in a teaching program. The program was called Summer Bridge. Some of you may know of Summer Bridge. There's one at the Huguley Academy. Anybody here from Huguley? No? I was a teacher. I taught 8th grade English, and I absolutely fell in love with teaching. And from that point on, I never looked back. I started to do youth work. I started to look into teaching opportunities. And when I graduated, the Summer Bridge program had a turnover in the directorship, and they asked me to apply for one of the co-director positions. And so I was very interested, and I did. And I did that for a few years and made some great relationships with some impressive young men. These are some of my former students. I knew these guys when they were like 11 years old, 12 years old. They were shorter than me. I could beat them in basketball. now I think they're all college graduates. They've all done quite well for themselves. Summerbridge is housed in independent schools, and so for me, it's exciting to come back here, to be in an independent school. I'm familiar with some of the structures and things here, and so it's not foreign to me. I did this work for a few years, and I wanted to really start to try to have an impact more systemically. So I went back to school for a master's in what's called risk intervention, and this is really something geared towards helping at-risk youth and help them to be more successful and not let their environment and social determinants determine where they end up. And from there I got excited about academia and got my doctorate in human development and came to Pitt School of Social Work and Center on Race and Social Problems, where I am a professor. So that's my journey, and I'll refer back to this because I think this is going to be important. And one last piece here, as was already mentioned, I am a proud parent. Here's my beautiful son. That was today. And here's my beautiful, beautiful wife who's in the front. You can tell we've got another one coming. Yeah, so now I feel better talking about parenting because I'm going through the rigors of it and going through the challenges of it. So, my colleague Ming Wong and I, and some others at Pitt, we have a project we call the Pittsburgh Parenting Project. And it's a partnership with Pittsburgh Public Schools and funded by the very generous Spencer Foundation. And what it is we look at the best practices in African American parenting. And for many, there's a question right off the bat: why is there a special set of practices for African American parenting? And the basic reason is that African Americans have a unique social history. I think any of us that have a sense of ethnic background know that we have a unique social history. But for African Americans and for Jewish people and many people, there are things in our history that we have to process. So we have to help our children process, and they can impact our lives today. And so that's the basics of that. And our goal is to develop an overarching framework that we can share with other parents to help them be the best that they can be. And it really breaks down into two large ways of thinking about race and parenting for this group. One is a set of culturally specific practices, things that this group might do that other groups might not do. Okay, and I think many groups might have those kinds of things. And then there are general practices that any parent might do, but they may be particularly important for this group. Okay, and just to say a little bit about what we found is that among African American parents, teaching them about racial heritage and racial pride is valuable. It's associated with higher academic outcomes, better mental health outcomes, and it makes them more resilient in the face of discrimination. So, and this is not just our work, there have been numerous works that have shown different aspects of this. And many African American families have these practices, most do. So it validates what they're doing. And we can also say that it's something that more should do. We also know that having a strong, centralized racial identity is associated with higher achievement for African American students. And that's very interesting because I think the popular narrative is that race is associated with lower outcomes for African Americans. But that's a demographic finding. When we talk about what race means to people, for kids who have a stronger sense of their racial heritage, and it's more important to who they are, they tend to be higher achievers. So that's really good to know for African American parents. And why is that the case? Well, we'll come back to that. And then some interesting things about differential effects. What we're doing now has suggested that for African American parents, when they have explicit grade requirements, where they say to their children, I want you to get all A's and B's or some standard, it's associated with higher achievement. We have found out in our data set that's not the case for white families. It doesn't seem to matter. It's a really interesting finding. And so people say, well, why is that? And we think it has to do with our collective history in the US. Because black students have an educational experience that's different from what white students have. They face a set of lower expectations. They tend to be in lower classes. It's way more normal for them to be low achievers, and they have to fight off lots of pressures in those areas, so we think this reinforcement becomes important. And then, some work has shown that, that there's something called too strict, but then for families in difficult communities or dangerous neighborhoods, they have to be a little stricter sometimes. Now, they still need to be emotionally responsive, but in this context, they might have to have some stricter policies than other families do. So, these are things that apply to any family, that happen in any families, but there are different effects for black families. Now, why do we find these kinds of effects? And I'll tie it to our subject tonight about race and parenting. Why does race matter for black parents? One is because they have to prepare their children to navigate what a good colleague of mine, John Diamond, at the University of Wisconsin calls racialized terrain in education and society. One thing we have seen in this election cycle, a lot of people wanted to really believe that we had moved past race in the US. And I think we find that we have not. Oh, there's a lot of people that have not. And what the process is, how do you process what we just saw with your children? How do you process the police brutality issues with your children? And these are things that African American families have been doing for a long time because they have been seeing society from a different lens for a long time. Then to understand and teach your children to understand the legacies that have created the disparities we see. I live in Swiss Elm Park, and I think we're in Squirrel Hill now, and very different communities from Homewood, Portland Hill District. Very different racial compositions, very different community resources, different situations. How do you process that? How do you process that? And I think that's a central question we have to ask ourselves when we think about race and parenting. I have to talk about current issues, forces that are still going, and injustices that perpetuate racial inequality. Now, people debate these things, right? People debate the extent to which race matters and things like that, but in black families, these are conversations. These are things that they're talking about. And there are things that I'm going to say, spoiled surprise, need to be on the table for racial justice conversations in all families. They have to process negative stereotypes. They have to process media images, and that's entertainment media, that's news media. The Heinz Foundation commissioned a study a few years ago, and I think they watched the evening news for about 3 months, and of maybe 70 plus stories on African American males, 60 something were crime related. So that means one thing for black kids. That's what they're being bombarded with. But then what does it mean for white kids who don't have a lot of contact with black kids? Because we live in a very segregated society. And so I think the overall message, to sum it up, and it's too complex to sum up, but it's like a still high rise message. Like, look, society has dealt us a bad hand, but we're smart, we're capable, and we shall overcome. We can make it through this. And this is the message that seems to be effective for black parents. And the data shows that when they're giving these messages, they're having better outcomes for their children. So we know that's true for that group. Why should all families, parents, caretakers be thinking about race? Why does it matter for all parents? All parents matter. I'll say that tonight. sure that the U.S. is truly a place of justice for all. You know, we know at least abstractly that's what we should be fighting for. And there are some more practical matters as well, you know, to ensure that our nation and world are leveraging all of our human resources. Why leave so many people behind, or why allow for so many to not maximize their potential? For the nation's future, you know, the projections have been for some time now that sometime close to the middle of this century, the nation is going to be a plurality. There will not be a white majority in the U.S. What does that mean? What does that mean for people? I think the fear, some people fear that and respond in a fear way, and some people say, well, let's make sure all of our citizens are really well equipped to carry on the legacy of the good things that we've done in our democracy. But it's a reality, and we have to prepare for it. And then for our children, and our selfish reasons, which are still noble, we want to help them operate in a very, very diverse society. We want to make sure they know how to handle themselves across cultural lines and be ready for anything. So, you know, I think ultimately it's in the best interest of our children, our country, that we have a clear sense of American racial history and justice, which I think are probably keys to doing that. Now, talking about race is for many, not for everybody, but for many, uncomfortable. And what makes talking about race uncomfortable? This picture's from the school I used to work at, and we had a class called Unity and Diversity in our independent school, and we challenged ninth graders to talk about race, and it was really weird for some of them. But when we pressed forward, it got easier. So, and we know this from my classmates in social problems at Pitt, people don't want to be viewed as a racist. You don't want to set on any landmines, you don't want to set up any triggers, you don't want to upset other people. And so it's easier to avoid race and frankly politics nowadays, these conversations, so as to avoid those kind of things. Sometimes they're just not safe spaces to ask your hard questions. They're difficult conversations to have because you don't know if you can really be true and open in those conversations. Some of us feel like, look, we shouldn't be emphasizing differences that we feel are arbitrary. I don't want to judge you based on your race. I don't want to draw attention to something that I'm trying to not make a factor in how I relate to you. And that's understandable. However, if we don't talk about race, how do we explain inequality? Racial inequality. This is, I think, a key question. And I think if we don't talk about race, we're left to our own devices, or we leave our kids to their own devices to make sense of inequality. And that can go a number of different ways. So I do want to talk about that tonight. I want to at least set the baseline for what we're dealing with now in terms of racial inequalities and challenges that Black families are facing today. And I like this quote from one of my favorite groups, Wu-Tang Clan. Some Wu fans in the audience. Life as a shorty shouldn't be so rough. And the full quote is actually, handcuffed in back of a bus, 40 of us, life as a shorty shouldn't be so rough. And Inspector Deck, the rapper, is talking about experience with juvenile incarceration. And there are many challenges. I mean, that quote captures many of the challenges we see. So family context in the U.S., for white families in the yellow bar, 74% of children, 74% of families with children have two parents. The number is much, much lower for Black families. We see the number in Pittsburgh. It's lower for everyone, but I think the disparity is also greater here. Economic disparities. The percentage of poverty in And family structure matters. As now we're talking about, you might be talking about one income. Percent of population in poverty, also massive gaps, racial gaps. So when we look, and this is especially true in Pittsburgh, because we actually have one of the poorest black populations in the U.S. of any metro area. I don't know if you knew that, but that is the case. So what that means is many times when we think of race, we're also seeing class in Pittsburgh. And if you haven't been anywhere else, your racial lens might be really focused in an area that's not necessarily the full story. Economic disparities, if you look at the poverty number, that's bad. If I don't have the income figures here, but I think blacks are in 60% of what whites are in terms of households. But look at the absolute wealth disparities. The black-white wealth disparity is like 22-1 for household assets. That's unbelievable. And I mean, that's a lot of tuition. That's a lot of resources. That's living in a better neighborhood. That's a lot of things that we all know are important. And then the criminal justice system. Staggering statistic, 1 in 3 African American men will be incarcerated at some point in their lifetime. And if you are familiar with Michelle Alexander's work, which is an incredible and essential read, when you get convicted of a felony and you get out of jail, you're not just a free person anymore. You are now a limited member of society. Your civil liberties, your economic opportunities are severely limited. So the number is only 1 in 17 for white men. And the ACLU has kind of been all over this, and they know that these disparities, they occur at every stage of the system. Stops and searches, arrests, persecutions, plea negotiations, trials and sentences. Every aspect. And they exist regardless of prior histories, and you can really isolate the racial factor and why people get longer sentences. People are more likely to be persecuted and to stop and things like this. And juvenile arrests. This is per 100,000. To summarize the rates, it's about 2-1 in the U.S. for black juvenile arrests and white juvenile arrests. In Pittsburgh, it's about 5-1. So, when we talk about education, school discipline is a key racial issue. And even though African Americans are only about 16% of public school students in the U.S., they make up about 42% of students with multiple suspensions, 34% of students that get expelled. And people have made a connection between those numbers and the criminal justice numbers, saying that there's a school-to-prison pipeline. And this is true for all races, but it disproportionately impacts black and Latinos. But there are zero-tolerance policies in schools. There's increased police presence in schools. And there are racial biases. And now, where you might have gotten in a fight 20 years ago in school and go to the principal's office, maybe you got in trouble. You could get arrested today. And you could have a record. And so the school-to-prison pipeline is something that people are very concerned with. And it's a mechanism for criminalizing youth, and particularly black. So all of that is occurring, and some of the results, I'd say, of that are just gaping educational disparities. Black students about 2 or 3 grade levels behind their white peers on different measures. Nationally, this is national data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. High school graduation rates are diminished. And so when we see all of those disparities, and that's a very depressing set of statistics, how do we make sense of it? How do we make sense of it? If we don't talk about race, how are our children going to make sense of it? And what I argue is that there's sort of this continuum. And on one end of the continuum, there's individual accountability and variations of that. So we say, well, on on the extreme end, it's 100% meritocracy. America is an opportunity, anybody can make it. I don't care, just work your butt off, and you could have done it. It's your fault, but you didn't. And then on the other end, structural oppression. You know, there are all these structural forces, it diminishes people's opportunities, and I guess in a theoretical extreme end, you would never blame anybody. But there are these forces that make it so that certain groups really have a struggle in terms of their success in this country. And all of us, I think, fit somewhere on this continuum. You know, and even at a very basic level, people know about slavery, right? So all of us have some sense of this, but the question is, where are we on it? And how, frankly, how accurate is our perspective and what we transmit to our children as we help them make sense of inequality and race? So, jumping from that point, how do we do this? And I want to start to talk about that. And one of my driving points is that if we talk about race, we have to process inequality. There's no way to do it. Otherwise, it becomes just kind of a fluffy diversity talk. You know, like we're talking about sock colors or something that is inconsequential. And first I say, you know, we have to tell the truth. And there's my guy from Concussion. You saw that movie. We have to help our youth understand the histories of injustices that have happened. And I think of Fixing History because it's so much about helping youth process how something could have happened. And what is our role in society in allowing these things and stopping things. And we have to help our youth have a clear, good sense of this. And there's acknowledging the present. Knowing the racial structures that are currently in place. And the frames that perpetuate inequality. We have to give fuller narratives, okay? Once we can kind of say, here are the things that have gone wrong, here are the things that are still going wrong, we have to present them with some things that are going right. Things that are going right. Because even if you look at a stat like the poverty stat, and you see that, okay, 30-something% of black families are in poverty, 60% are not. So if we only think about poor when we think black, we're thinking of, we're not, it's not accurate. That's not an accurate perception. So how are we providing our children with fuller understandings? And here I say, you know, rich and sophisticated cultural histories. And give your children a chance to know those who are different from themselves. And we have such a segregated society. We don't really live around each other. How can we build those bridges? Because nothing is going to do it like actual human contact. So I'll take those points and sort of think about them one at a time. And the first is this idea of a true explanation for racial disparities. We have to really talk to our kids and help them to know some real good facts around them. And the challenge, I think, is to tell the truth. We must first know it ourselves. And Noam Chomsky has this, let's talk about this idea of intentional ignorance in our society. And he was specifically talking about racial oppression in the U.S. and the history of it. And I teach a class on race and socialization, race and social problems. And I get students, many that they're interested in race, some that just have to take a class and that's the only time that works for them, Thursday night, 6 o'clock. And I have been fascinated by how little of this that these Pitt masters and doctoral students have ever heard. We know about slavery, we have some vague sense of that. We have some vague sense of, Jim Crow, that people were segregated, couldn't ride the bus in the same spaces and restaurants. But there's a lot more hardcore history than that. But before we even talk about that in my class, the first thing I teach my students, and I think we have to teach our children, is that there's a history to African Americans, Latinos, other people that was before slavery, before European contact or major dealings. And we talk about that because there were very sophisticated and very advanced societies in West Africa, not just Egypt, in Central Africa. And we talk about it, we read about it, and people are really legitimately amazed that they had never heard that. And why is that important? Because if you look at society today, and you see the disparities I just talked about, then if you understand there's a history of wholeness, of nation, of community, of family, then you can say something has gone wrong. This is not the natural way for this people. And we don't have that in the U.S. We don't build that into our understanding. And so I think this is a very critical point as we think about our children and think about promoting justice for our young people. After we talk about that, we do talk about sort of this cascade of really oppressive forces in the U.S. that were really deliberately done, and there's no way to sugarcoat it. And none of this is conspiracy theory. This is just hardcore facts of American history that are not attractive, that do not get discussed very much. We do know about the slave trade. We do know that was disruptive. We do deal with that in my course, but then we talk about the Reconstruction era. And we watch a documentary called Aftershock from the History Channel, and it's sort of graphic actually for the History Channel. But we talk about what happened after the Civil War and the terrorism that was enacted upon African Americans. There were between 3,000 and 4,000 lynchings between after the Civil War and the middle of the 20th century, and public executions. And that was part of the culture and part of the society that was accepted. And I know, in this room we can imagine that because we have talked about atrocities, I'm sure. But it doesn't get talked about enough in our schools and in our homes. And these are difficult conversations, so we'll talk about that. But there were very bad things that happened after slavery. There was the complete annihilation of the black vote, disenfranchisement in the South. They held constitutional conventions to stop black people from voting. And there was a point after the Civil War in the 1870s where there were a higher percentage of black politicians represented in the South than there are today. That's an unbelievable fact. The first few years after the Civil War were years of great progress. There were really some strides being made, and people suppressed it. And you can read, if you were in my class, I would show you news clippings about how people felt about the black vote and making sure that it was stopped. And we talk about inequality and Jim Crow, and then along the way we talk about media portrayals. And what the media does to reinforce race and stereotypes and justify what we see. The media has always been an instrument of that. I'll say more about that in a second. And then I think what really gets people is we talk about the 20th century. And I think people know about civil rights, but not about economic rights. Not about things that matter for your quality of life, your chance to educate your children, your chance to have a safe community. And so we talk about what Ira Katz-Nelson has called white affirmative action. And lots of people don't know that things that we cherish in the U.S., like the New Deal, the Army GI Bill, these policies were deliberately structured to severely limit black participation. And that was on purpose, because the Southern political bloc did not want that. From New Deal provisions, they excluded industries where blacks were employed. farm work and domestic work. And in the GI Bill and the New Deal, they allowed for local administration of the benefits. And what that meant was that if a black family wanted to, if a black soldier returning from war wanted to get an education loan, he had to go probably to a Southern loan officer, a white loan officer. 70% of African Americans were in the South at this time, and try to get that loan, and it just didn't happen. There was a year, 1947, where in Mississippi they gave out 3,200 GI Bill provision loans for small businesses for education. 3,200 plus loans, and 2 went to African Americans. 2. This is money, this is finance, this is economics, and these are federal policies. If you're familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates, the writer for The Atlantic, he has a wonderful piece on residential and discrimination, housing discrimination. The FHA in the middle of the 20th century made provisions so that regular people could afford homes. That wasn't always the case. You had to have, 30% of the down payment, you had to pay it off in 10 years. People couldn't afford that, they lowered those standards, and boom, that is one of the building blocks of the American middle class. 60% of American wealth is home ownership. Well, they locked blacks out of that because they would only insure loans in white communities, and they said these could not be diverse communities. The insurable communities, this is called red lines, were white communities. So what do you do if you're in a white community? And then black families move into your community. Families were terrorized. Families were bombed. Cross burnings. And white families that were allies were also terrorized. And that's mean. That's terrible to do, but that was also federally instigated, if you will, by the policies. So you have a black community that's been locked out of housing, locked out of these other building blocks of the American middle class, the GI Bill, the New Deal, and the economic suppression, the economic disparities. It cannot be understood without understanding those facts. These are the building blocks of economic inequality in the U.S. Obviously post-slavery. And we can say more. The last thing I will mention is racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. And we talk about that, or we will tomorrow. Really heinous things have happened in the criminal justice system. The war on drugs has been incredibly racially skewed, despite the fact that when you look at the rates of use and sales, they're pretty comparable across race. And that fact alone blows people away. But we've targeted black and brown communities, and it's been easy to do because they're not economically or politically empowered. And what happens is that you put millions of black men away, and the resulting families now trying to exist in poverty and with one parent, just terrible. So this is sort of a litany of actions that we as a society have done. Most of these in the 20th century that really impact what we see today. And this is a lot. I'm not saying, get your 6 or 7 year old and sit down and start going through this. It's probably not the best approach, but we have to find ways to tell the full truth, or it's not going to make sense. And so I'll have some ideas, but I think this is a challenge for us as parents, as educators, to find ways to do this. Just one quote from one of my students in responding to this learning, and this is about the African history. He or she said, although it is logical that there will be African American history that dates prior to slavery in Europe and America, it never consciously crossed my mind that this would be the case. It's remarkable how rich the cultural history is. Phenomenal architecture, booming cities, beautiful art, powerful and influential leaders, and an incredible amount of cultural progress. However, even with this rich history, so many are unaware. It is a product of the deep systemic racism that exists in our country. That's kind of an open question. I wonder why we don't talk about it, why we don't teach that. It's a good question for us. So what do families do that talk about race? And in African American families, talking about race is normal. As many as 50% of African American youth report discrimination experiences in school. So lots of black kids are coming home and telling their parents, my teacher, I feel like they discriminated against me. It's not necessarily overt, but it's their perception. I was excluded from this group, and I know there was kind of a racial undertone to it, or maybe they said the N-word to me or something like that. As many as 80% of parents use racial socialization practices in black families. They talk about race, most of them talk about positive aspects of their racial history, and many prepare their children for violence. These are two very different actions. Presenting a positive history and preparing children for violence. I would argue for all parents, we need to present positive images and histories of people, various peoples, and tell our kids about injustice. What we found in the literature and also in our own work is that the tougher conversations, like the things I just listed, those probably come later. They start to happen in adolescence. Although for some families, they have to process racial encounters. They don't have the luxury of not talking about it. It's funny to think that, ideally it'd be nice to be race blind, but sometimes the race comes to the children. They don't ask for it. And so they've got to make sense of it. But early on, many families, they present positive images. They present children's books. They present media. They take trips. They go to museums, plays, shows. And interesting, very interesting and true, race blind outlook is associated with negative outcomes for black youth. It's not a positive, on average, it's not a positive indicator for black families and youth, okay? So they need to talk about race. It's something that they do. Now, how can we tell this tough truth in all families? Well, these tough truths, not all the truths are tough, some are beautiful. I think in some ways it's similar to how we approach other difficult conversations. And some of the black parents that we've talked to have said, race conversations about bias are one of our difficult conversations. We have to talk to our kids about difficult things in life, and that's part of what we do. And I think for all of us, that also can be one of our tough conversations, about racial inequities. We have to know it ourselves, though, to really have a good conversation. We have to have a pretty good sense of it. And then I think we have to be intentional. We have to really actively make it part of what we do. I know, I'm sure, many, if not most, community day parents have a lot of developmental outcomes for their children. My wonderful wife and I, we've got what to expect in the first year, what to expect in the second year, seventh year, 10th year. We think about these things, right? We have to be also intentional about, if you want to be a parent that teaches your kid about justice and racial justice, you have to be intentional and seek it out. So there's providing texts, right? There are, this is the internet age, there are great children's books, adolescent books that tell various aspects of racial storylines. And the thing that we have to do is kind of normalize it. Make it normal to consume media and texts that are outside of your culture or of racial, ethnic minority culture, not just on your school summer reading list. We do something in my class I call it the Black Movie Quiz, and I flash all of these great black films and to see how many people have actually seen them. And it's so it's every time as I flash them, the black students are commenting and saying stuff like that. The white students are like, no one says anything. And I think they haven't seen them. And I'll say more about that, but I think we just have to reach out and say, yeah, there's stuff for me there. And the positive histories early in life, the positive stories, they don't have to be histories, they can be fiction, and difficult truths a little bit later. And we don't have to, and I think we do this in America, everything has to have a happy ending. Right? Every movie has to have, if a movie doesn't have a happy ending, you are not happy. Unless you're a real snooty film person, you know, still. But history doesn't necessarily have a happy ending. Very often it's not. And one person's happy ending is someone else's tragedy. And that's actually the fuller story, isn't it? So we cannot parade this great American triumph story and not talk about what has happened for Native Americans and what has happened for African Americans. And it's a luxury, because for some families, they don't have a triumph story. Native American families, history is not a triumph story. So I think we all should share that burden and tell the true, fuller history. And I think it's okay to let kids know our society is a work in progress. We are not where we need to be as a society. You know, that's okay. And that's probably something actually everybody agrees on, right? In their own unique way. So I think these are ways that we begin to approach telling these tougher truths and telling these histories. And then the second task is to acknowledge the present. And if you recognize this wonderful woman, she was the Trump campaign manager in Ohio, who said at one point that if black people in the last 50 years haven't made it, it's their own fault. They haven't made it. And that there was no racism before Obama. So, can't agree with that. Okay, cannot agree with that second point. We have to know the racial frames that are current. And we spend time talking about that in my course as well. So what keeps disparities going? Why don't they just die out and, reach an equilibrium point or something? Well, the wealth begets wealth. I think we understand that. We understand compound interest is mathematical fact. If the market's going up, you don't have to do anything. Just have money there. But wealth begets wealth and poverty begets poverty. So if you have a long head start, you're going to be doing a lot better unless there's some kind of intervention. Family structure breakdowns. And, there's a lot of discussion as to why we see, higher breakdown numbers in black families. But I think the scholarship is clear that prior to slavery, that was not normal. And this is why that piece is important. That was not the case in the West African cultures and Central African cultures. So how do we get to that point? But when you have the broken family structures, they're hard to rebuild generationally. They really are. And so it perpetuates inequality. People are still trying to disenfranchise voters. I cannot believe it, but there are still people that are trying to do things to stop groups of people from voting. And we have ongoing residential segregation. And we all know that the racial composition of your neighborhood matters. And they say, if a neighborhood becomes more than 30% people of color, white people start to move out of that neighborhood. That's today. The values are not going to be as high in communities of color. And home ownership is the #1 wealth builder in the U.S. And so these, once they're in motion, they're self-perpetuating. Educational inequalities. So you ended up in a neighborhood that didn't really have good schools, where teachers really wouldn't want to teach unless they had to, then it's going to be hard for you to get a great education, and then it's going to be hard to pass that on to your children. Many of us are good at helping our children succeed because we understand education. We've got the cultural capital to teach them how to do well in school. Well, there's a generational cycle where this isn't happening, so the question is how you intervene. This idea of mass incarceration. When you incarcerate a generation of fathers, You may not like the results of what you get a generation later when the children are coming of age. And how will they know how to be fathers and mothers themselves when they haven't seen it? So it's perpetual. Access and quality health care, and that's very much an issue as well. And then there are a couple of things that I want to talk a little bit more specifically about. Evolving racist frames, and what does racism look like in the Obama era? And people have done some good work about that I think we also need to be able to communicate. And then lastly, I spent a little more time with this media piece. And a good source is this book by Eduardo Bonilla Silva on racism without racists. Fascinating. Fascinating topic. So let's talk about this idea. Racism without racists. So what happens when we don't discuss race? What happens when we, and more importantly, we don't really unpack our histories and really have strong knowledge about race in the US? Well, we get some good old-fashioned hate and ignorance-fueled, overt, in-your-face, I-hate-you racism. Okay? And this is kind of how we all think of racism. This is our fundamental idea of racism. And we had a great example, not great, it was from what happened, but from an academic perspective, very fitting. We had this woman who said in West Virginia, it will be so refreshing to have a classy, beautiful, dignified First Lady back in the White House. She's talking about Donald Trump's wife. I'm tired of seeing Abe in heels. This was, I think, this week. And Beverly Walling says, just made my bed, Pam. And Beverly Walling is the mayor of that town. Beverly Walling resigned. And I don't know what happened to Pamela. She also had some kind of post.
She got fired.
She was fired. Okay. So that's out there. And I think that's what we definitely saw in the election cycle. This a lot more of the surface. And anti-Semitism. Many bad feelings that we thought had faded. And there's still a very strong base for them. And there's, biological racism. People, this kind of has faded from the mainstream. Some people still think that, like, intellectual abilities are attributable to biology. It's not really well supported in science. And then a big one, I think, today is cultural racism. And it's where you say, okay, I can go and look at that community and see that these people are not doing what would be beneficial. So there's something about their culture that they're doing to themselves. And you can say this without saying, I'm not like a racist, I wouldn't treat you differently because of your race. But culturally, I think this group has sabotaged themselves. And it's an interesting perspective. And I think that one of the extensions of that, and I'll give an example from my own experience, is that when you subscribe to this, you're kind of apprehensive around people in that group. And this is one of the things I have experienced where I'll go I've had an experience where I went into a business, kind of an upscale business. I went in one day, I was dressed like this, and I was treated exceptionally well. People were giving me water bottles, asking me, how I'm doing, if I need anything. And I went back the next day, just in my street clothes, and no one talked to me. No one spoke to me. Now maybe they just had very different days. But I talked to the manager, and he dealt with it. He watched the video, and he said, there's a problem with that. Something was not right there, and we're going to deal with it as a staff. And so that was anti-racism right there. But I find, and I think this is true for many people of color, you have to show that you're okay. You have to show that you're okay, and then people relax. But in the initial interaction, they might be a little apprehensive. And I think probably more of us can relate to that than we would probably admit. Okay? You lock your door in certain streets and things like that. certain people walk by, then that's part of it. But there's a cultural racism. And the problem with it is that often it's not grounded in history. There's sort of a pragmatic racism too. And what I mean by that is people will kind of say, like, well, your group is better off. So, you know, and I'll mention this, I'll respond to this on the next slide. I'll just say it now. But people will say blacks are better off here than they are in Africa. So you should be thankful for slavery. People say this. And the irony in that is it's not just that how bad slavery was, I should be thankful, but it's also, when you look at Africa, how did Africa get the way it is? It was ravished by Europe. And the Berlin Conference, which if you're not familiar with, you can actually go and look this up, it's unbelievable. But there was a conference, I forget the year now, but in the late 1800s, Europe divvied up Africa. They just divvied it up and said, okay, you take this, you take that, and they went and they committed genocides, they committed atrocities, and they exploited the land. And that's how, and they pitted tribes against each other. So when you see something like Rwanda, you see something like Somalia, these tribes were pitted against each other. One was made like a police group, and one was put in a different role. So when Europe pulls out, there's retribution now for years of abuse. And there are post-racial perspectives. Now we move past race, and I think if anything, the election cycle has really challenged a lot of these post-racial perspectives. But the one that I think is really important for us to unpack is colorblind racism. And this is what Benia Silva talks about, and I think it's something we need to be ready to address with young people. So what is colorblind racism? A component of it is, well, let me say what it is. When you say, I don't see race, you know, I judge you only as you are, but I'm not going to think about your race. We shouldn't have to think about race. And there's a noble side to that I think we all can value. But the problem is that it also can be very ahistorical. And it's also kind of, in many ways, impossible. Like if I said to you, I don't see gender. You know, when I see you, I don't see a man or a woman or anyone, I just see a person. And we can believe that, but I think we also know that it's so pervasive and ingrained in who we are that I don't know if it's all the way true. And race is similar. There are studies on what they call implicit bias. These are our subconscious racism. And they're not just racism, they have other group studies too. And what they've shown is that subconsciously, through these different experimental exercises, when you ask people, when you look at people's racial preferences, 80% of whites have basically a white preference over a black preference. 80%. The interesting thing also is that among black people, 40% of black people have a white preference when they did these exercises. Maybe some of you are familiar with the Kenneth Clark doll experiments, where they showed dolls to black children, and they said the white doll is a pretty doll, the white doll is a smart doll. These are very, very young children. We condition ourselves and our society to see race, or to make racial assumptions, even if it's not overt. So, colorblindness is really a wishful thinking. But it also can be ahistorical, and it cannot be informed by the true racial history of the country. And that's when it's really, really problematic. Because you still, again, you have to have some working theory for inequality. You have to. And, you know, colorblindness allows you to say, I believe in equal opportunity, but because I believe in that, I'm against something like an affirmative action. Because now you're getting an advantage. No, we should all be equal. Again, noble, but not understanding that affirmative action is a response to gross inequalities. And then, there's an attribution of things rooted in racial injustice to individual choice. Like people will say, and there's lots of data and quotes. Oh, people, black people want to live in black neighborhoods, but people want to live in white neighborhoods. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's actually not the history. Black people very much try to integrate and were shut down. And wealth differences. It's not just because black people don't like to save. You save, they don't save. When they've done studies and looked at families with similar overall histories, similar histories of wealth over generations, their financial patterns are very similar. So there's something we learn about spending and saving that is also tied to these structural patterns. And then minimizing the effects of racism today, to say that it's not really that important anymore. And it's actually interesting in black families, because some black families don't want to, and I think they're right, they don't want to scare their kids. They don't want to tell them so much that they're now scared that they're not going to be able to be successful. And that is a burden that they have to find that balance. But it's not fair from an outside perspective to not tell the history or to minimize it. And, I already talked about this myth here. And then, there's this idea that, well, my ancestors weren't slave owners. I'm not really responsible. Why would I want to do anything around retribution or reparation? And my ancestry immigrated here with nothing, they made it up. This is really a meritocracy. Anybody can make it. My family history is proof of that. But if you really look at the history of European immigration to the U.S., European immigrants had a lot of advantages over African Americans. African Americans were systematically lowered in the workforce. They had less access to unions. They had less access to promotion and opportunity. Less access to some of the economic policies that were valuable, like the Homestead Act, for example. Blacks really couldn't access the Homestead Act, which provided land to families for low cost. So, when we think about that, I gotta put my man Kendrick Lamar, who's a great rap artist and very conscious and thoughtful in his work. These racist frames are not historical, they're heavily underinformed. And frames like colorblindness, they don't explain inequality. Colorblindness does not explain inequality, which leads us then to our assumptions and what we might find from other sources. And who wants to talk about race? Hate groups. Hate groups talk about race. So if we don't talk about race, it's not like nobody talks about race. The media hits us with images. That's where a lot of our implicit bias comes from. And there are other groups that are willing to talk about it in ways that we don't control. And we can't steer the conversation. And I think that ultimately we want to present ourselves as having a heart for equity that's informed by history. So you want to fight for justice, and you need a historical reform perspective to do that from. And that's what you want to pass on to your children. So understanding these current racial frames and their limitations, I think, is important. Understanding how things work as a cyclical pattern once they're set in motion is important. These are things that we at some point have to tell our young people, help them to understand. So we're doing that, but what else? And is it all doom and gloom? No, I don't think so. So on the flip side, we also have to provide fuller narratives. And this is something that in African American families happens naturally. I think in Jewish families happens naturally. We tell positive stories about our people. And there are lots of ways to do that. But I think media is a great way to do it. I just throw up a few examples. Great Invaders is a great movie. Blackish is a pretty funny show. And it's pretty positive as far as accomplished middle-class black families. And then books, and this is one that we read to our son, Jonathan, and his mom. So, seeing other groups, seeing them in normalized lights is not something that's really all that difficult. We just just have to be proactive about doing it. We also have to do it in a racially just way. We have to help our children be consumers, and literate consumers of media from a racial perspective. And this has to be on our radar, because they're being bombarded with racial images all the time. Almost literally every second. There's a great documentary, Ed.D. Notions, that talks about the racial history of media in the U.S. It's a little old now, it only goes up to the 80s, but it gives you an incredible history. And it's important to know that media has always scaffolded the racial hierarchy. Many people don't know this, but even the word Jim Crow comes from the media. It comes from entertainment. It comes from a white guy named T.D. Rice, who was imitating a crippled black guy that he had seen in blackface and doing an exaggerated performance of that. And it became, and this is the origin of Bad Blackface, a minstrel show, and it actually became the #1 entertainment sensation in the country at this time. And so for lots of people in America that did not know black people, this was their first encounter, or one of their most salient encounters with black imagery. And it was very much a buffoonery, a mockery. And some would argue that that's similar to what happens even now. And here's a visual. So in the slavery time, when you think about media, the role of the media or entertainment or how blacks were portrayed, they were seen as docile. They were presented, men were presented as childish, women were presented as asexual. And this actually served a purpose. Because how do you justify slavery? How do you justify something like that? You have to dehumanize people. You have to make it seem like this is in their best interest. They're not capable. And so this is why the men were portrayed this way. Women were presented as asexual because they often had roles in the home. And they didn't want to be perceived as a threat to the wife. But then post-slavery, and the best example of this is the Birth of a Nation, the original Birth of a Nation movie. But blacks are dangerous, they're violent. Their better place was actually back in slavery. Now that they're out, they're terror, they're problematic. They cannot really be truly intelligent. And the problem with this is that this actually did incite violence and negative forces against blacks. In the middle of the 20th century, you see some sort of perverted process, but blacks are seen as still maybe potentially civil, but still savage. In the movies that you see from the 20s and the 30s, 40s, they demonstrate that. They're a poor moral character. You can't trust them. They can appear smart, but they're not to be really trusted. And if we look at the late 20th century and now, I think we see this ostentatious presentation, conspicuous consumption, irresponsible, lazy, and ultimately what? Responsible for their own play. We don't have the social structures that we had in 1880 or 1940. So the reason that you're in this situation is because you want to be in that situation, or you don't want to work your way out of it. And it's amazing how the media sort of corresponds with these dominant narratives. And we can talk about other groups, right? We can talk about Asian men, Asian women, Latinos. We have so many racial stereotypes in entertainment. I've heard PBS made is a little subversive, I haven't seen it, but certainly plays up on the presentation. And the reverse of this, and what we need, and I think as parents, what we need to present are holistic, dramatic images. We need to show full and true stories. They don't have to be historical. In fact, they shouldn't all be historical, but they should be things that portray people as fully human. Things that might win an Oscar, right? When you think about the Oscar movies, they're always this dramatic human story, right? That's the kind of thing that we need more of, that we need to share. But when we think about those movies, blacks are dramatically underrepresented, no pun intended. In the history of the Oscars, there's been like 176 Best Man and Best Woman Oscar combined. There have only been 8 winners of color out of 176. Viola Davis, great, talented actress. She's in Fences, Pittsburgh story. Emmys have been awarded since 1968. The one she won last year was she was the first black female ever to win for Best Actress in a drama. Ever. And I think I got okay, move on. I had a little video, but we won't watch it. But when she won, she said that it's not for lack of talent, it's for lack of opportunity. And when blacks do win these awards, and this is really interesting. I've cataloged all of the Best Actor, Best Actress winners that are African American. So we have, I just want to point out what their characters are. The first, Patty McDaniel, she was a Manny, literally played a Manny. Octavia Spencer was a housekeeper. Morgan Freeman was a chauffeur. Lupita was a slave. I think I know which one. Denzel was an ex-slave turned soldier once, for one of them. We had a biographical dictator. Now, biographies do make it for African Americans. We had a crooked cop. Denzel came back and got it for a crooked cop. Jamie Foxx won for the biography. We had Jennifer Hudson, she was a singer. And then we had Monique, single abusive black mother. We had Halle Berry, who was a struggling single mom. Cuba Gooding Jr. was kind of a comedic sidekick. Whoopi Goldberg won for Ghost, which is a great movie, but she was like an asexual psychic in that movie. She actually, so she had no love interest. Lou Gossett Jr., asexual drill instructor. And that's one of the things that you find with black roles. You know, they had Morgan Freeman play Shaft. If you remember Shaft from the 70s, what is the thing about Shaft? Shaft was a ladies' man. Well, Morgan Freeman did not have a love interest in that movie. Not Morgan Freeman, sorry, Samuel Jackson. And Sidney Poitier, maybe my favorite, he was an inspirational handyman that had a nunnery. The point being that these roles are just, they're not out there in the mainstream. They're not getting mainstream publicity where they do exist. So, if we need to present our children with fuller stories and fuller images, we have to kind of go out and be proactive and look for it. And there's some good films out there. Like, one of my personal favorites is Five Heartbeats. Like, you won't watch that and not like it. It's family friendly. It's a great movie. I think a lot of black families have seen that. It's great. Historical dramas, like the original Tuskegee Airmen, which I like a little better than the Red Tails that came out a few years ago. And then, of course, there's real life. This African American History Museum I'm super excited to go to. And one of the things they're saying is that to promote it, is African American, it's not just for African Americans. African American history is our history. And you have to consume these things, and ultimately, I mean, make it part of your rotation, make it normal. It's just not normal for people, but make it normal. When, you know, we all try to get our kids to watch educational things, make this part of that rotation as well. And just, you have to think about it yourself. We think about violence content, we think about sexual content. We have to think about this content. And I was presented unbalanced consumption. And that goes for media, that goes for movies, and it goes for music, I think I should say. And we have to talk about it. We have to process these images. we have to process these conversations in, especially in the news. News images are very biased. And if we don't have real contact, then this is it. This is it. This is how our kids are learning. So we have to be attentive to it. And then task 4, provide opportunities. And as much as we try to think about media and media images, we have to allow our children to know each other and meet each other. And there are studies that show children who actually have exposure to people of other races are less likely to have stereotypes or hold stereotypes. It makes sense. It makes sense. So we need to find and develop integrated spaces for our children. Clubs, music, sports, community centers, and schools. Schools. You know, and I know that this is a Jewish-centered school. And I totally support that mission. I support African-American colleges for the same reasons. But if we don't have it in the student body, how do we facilitate it? Is there a sister school that we can partner with and try to do some joint activities? I mean, Pittsburgh schools are highly segregated, like a lot of schools are highly segregated, period. So it's not going to be hard to find like an all-black school. But how do we start to build these networks? And I mean, you gotta kind of try to be intentional to build diversity without being creepy, you know? Try to get your black friends and things like that. But we're trying to act normal. But I do think it's about being proactive and entering into spaces that you wouldn't have entered into. Maybe you go to community activities that are in black communities that are for children. And push for diversity in your school and in the curriculum. And the curriculum is very important. And welcoming diversity into your neighborhood. You know, when we were about to get a great neighborhood, got some of my neighbors here, but the day we were coming to get the house inspected, the police followed us and stopped me and asked me why I was driving so slow through the neighborhood. Me and my wife. You know, could have just been extra level of security, but I mean, from what I understand, like a lot of couples drive slowly through neighborhoods to look at houses. It wasn't like 11 at night. That would have, I agree, that might have been a little different. But we've got to want this. We've got to want integration, and that's probably one of the very best ways. So kids can grow up together. But we have to be proactive, and I think that's an underlying message. We have to be proactive about these things. And then be active. Be an ally. Take it slow. There really have not been successful movements for racial justice in the country that were not unified efforts. That's a fact. Black people can't do it alone. People of color can't do it alone. This is an effort for all of us. So part of that is we're all welcome to be part of this. And frankly, with this new election, I think we all have a stake. I think anti-semitism, anti-women, these are things that now seem to be in play in a mainstream way. So we all have a stake in this justice. And we can all be on board. And we have some great historical quotes. You know, we know that injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. We know the quote of first they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a socialist, and so forth. We all have a stake, and we need to make it a priority. And I think that's the most important thing. So where do we go from here? I want to plug where I work. We have discussions on race that are public. They provide lunch once a month. We have public talks on race issues as it from race and social problems. So I would highly recommend, you can just go online and find it, get on the mailing list and come out. And, you know, if you're an introvert, you just go, sit in the back and get a sandwich and hear a lecture. And we try to bring in good people. All right, we try to bring in good people. There's a race and reconciliation dialogue group in Pittsburgh. I've interacted with them before, and they seem like they really are trying to do good work. We want to be active. There's really important texts, and I drew a lot of what I said tonight from texts, and I gave a lot of information, and that was intentional, because I think that's the starting point. And this new Jim Crow book by Michelle Alexander is absolutely a game changer. If you only read one of these books, I mean, I don't know who's going to go read them all, but I admire that. But I think this is one of those that we should all read these books. Benita Silva really gets into modern day racism and what it looks like, and then Ira Katz-Nelson goes into great detail about 20th century economic inequality and discrimination and oppression. And it's a fantastic and shocking set of information. There's great documentaries out there. I love documentaries. And my students know this because you can get a lot in an hour and a half. And the house I live in about 90 minutes, you can know a whole lot about mass incarceration and race. And it's very well done. Aftershock, ethnic notions, I've touched on those. And I think we have to really, really be conscious of our intent. And be conscious to make this a priority. And be conscious to not be afraid to make mistakes. I think one thing I've learned about parenting is that you're going to do a bunch of things and be like, man, well, with the next kid, we're not doing that again. But the main thing is to try and really make it a point and get in groups and build with friends and build with allies and people that you feel supported by. But if you make the effort, you will find a way to do this well. So I thank you for your time and for listening to me, and I'm ready for questions. That was cool. I'm like, is that one of those real standing ovations, or is that from those everyone's sitting around me? So I'll take it either way. There's no mic going around, right? I'll try to repeat the question. Yes.
It was a real standing ovation.
Oh, thank you. Okay, good. It's official.
So I don't want my now 2-year-old to show up as a college undergrad in your class and not have an accurate understanding of racial history in our country and our world. So are there curriculum? Are there books that we can push for in our public schools to tell an accurate story?
Yeah, and this is the part I think about being, once you become aware of this as a whole, if you're intentional about it, you'll find sources. So there are curricula that are specifically designed with that in mind. There's a guy named Tyrone Howard at UCLA that I know works with groups to develop those kinds of curricula. If you were to Google, multicultural children's books, you will find a lot of different kinds of things like that. So there are things out there. As far as my class, the class actually is not for people that are super experts, but they'll probably be bored. But so I do a lot to try to build the information and understand. But yeah, there's some good things out there that are happening. I see someone back there.
I'm just coming up closer so you can hear me.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time online, and I read a lot of my social media friends of color saying, I'm tired of trying to educate white people about this mess. And they talk about white fragility, and they feel really frustrated is how I read it. And so I'm looking for respectful places and ways to enter the conversation that doesn't make me more part of the burden.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and that's real. And they got the safety pin thing now that's going around and people are reacting to. I think my best advice is that that's not everyone. You know, I think this is what we need. We need multicultural coalitions, right? We really need to get people from different backgrounds together. And there's a whole group of people of color and social justice people that don't want to be in that space, but there are people that do want to be in that space. And so I don't know that group has the same, they're not as active maybe on social media, but I think we need to find ways to identify it and find people. And maybe that's something we can, you know, in our center talk a little bit more about and start building some support around that. I personally think it's very important. When we talked about higher education in the summer at one of our institutes, and race in higher education, we talked about the role of white allies, and one of our faculty on the panel talked about that and what that role was. So, I understand that. I think it is something that we have to deal with, and I think we all, whoever's invested in that, we have to try to maybe even create those spaces. And as a person of color, I can maybe even think about who I know that's there. All right, here.
Yeah, we actually, since I don't know you, we actually just created a Facebook group specifically for that this week. It's called like People Talking About Racism. We have some people of color, but primarily it's exactly for that, for white people who have friends of color who are like, please stop making me your history professor, do your own homework, and kind of facilitating that discussion and stuff like that. I don't know if you can find it on Facebook. I mean, you can find me, but if you don't know me, I don't know, that would be easy, but that's something that we do with other people in your group. And it's, I mean, we're actually reading the new Jim Crow, and we have some people of color who are willing to come and do like a live face check, so we're not just this white silo of thought, but it's definitely with this idea that the burden of the learning and education is on us, so that's the space that we're
You know, one of the things that when I first came is, you know, my wife and I both on the line,
I'm sorry, I can't hear
my wife and I work on the line. We moved here in 2011. And one of the things that I noticed is we kind of had to explain this to my wife about like the way the news is portraying a lot of the areas, especially black neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. And being that, you know, coming from a black city, basically, which is a high black population, you know, we noticed that with the news. And then, you know, as, you know, living here, you know, you have this whole WTAE situation with the news anchor. I can't remember her name.
Wendy Bell.
We have the polarizing. On the other end, we have from police chief, Pittsburgh police chief, who was an advocate for communities. It's almost seemed like there's a reverse, or it's like a reverse racism type of situation, where when reaching out to these communities, it seemed like other communities didn't appreciate the fact that they're doing that. And so the question for me is that when you're looking at the news, either by CNN or wherever you're looking at, how do you differentiate between the truth of what message they need to bring communities together? And, you know, even your city news, trying to figure out, well, what do I grab here that I can take away at the end of it, you know, that you bring those communities together but still separate the untruths from the real truth.
Great question. I mean, the news is such a problem that there's no easy answers there. I think that what we really need is stronger sort of media watch advocacy efforts, and I think there's a group that I'm going want to tell you a name, but there's a professor named Latrell Crittenton. He's at Robert Morris. He's part of a group that I think pushed back against Wendy Bell and have begun the fight to make news more representative. Local news, and maybe to some degree national, they say what? When it bleeds, it leads. And they're going to have the more sensational stories, often up front, but the color skew of those stories is really problematic. And I think you don't have the sort of black establishment in Pittsburgh that you have in Atlanta, where there's a lot more political clout and power structure there that it probably wouldn't fly the same way. And so that's something that needs to be built. That's something that needs to be built. I think with our children, the conversation is, I think that we need to have them in a place where this is not their only exposure. There's not the overexposure. And that they, to some degree, know, because we've talked about it, that the news tends to be skewed. They tend to show sensational violence and other stories, and they tend to show more communities of color. And the dynamics around that, I couldn't really articulate. Maybe it's because the access is there, maybe it's because they can go into those communities and not get as much pushback. But it's something that we need to help our young people, our children, and teens process for sure, and fight the activist battle, I think, to change it. I can see a hand, I can't see a person. Okay, hey!
I want to do 3 plus and questions.
You might want to come up and plug. I don't know if you can hear you. If you want to go ahead.
The first plug is a film, Race the Power of an Illusion, if people have not heard of it. Race the Power of an Illusion, it's a 3-hour film, I think Leah Silver's in it.
Okay.
And it gives a really good history of the construction of race as a social construct in America. The second is, in our work at the Office of Child Development, we've been working with the Carnegie Library, and they have actually started to create a positive racial identity book list. And if you Google it, you can probably find it. If not, just call the library and ask them how to find it. And then the third plug is our study that we did. It's called Positive Racial Identity Development in Early Childhood, Understanding Pride in Pittsburgh, the acronym PRIDE. The Office of Child Development created this scan of positive racial identity development. So if anybody here is interested in learning about how all of this applies to very young children, because we were looking at children 3 to 6, then that's a resource. And the question is, could you talk a little bit about why it's so important to start having these conversations at a young age?
Okay, thank you. So they're doing great work at the Office of Child Development at Pitt, and definitely check out the Pride report and those other resources. Starting at a young age, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. Children of color start to have racialized experiences, that they can have racialized experiences at young ages. And children start to notice differences very early. And I mean, I think the Kenneth Clark doll experiment really demonstrates that. When you have 4 or 5-year-old kids saying that this black doll is the ugly doll and this white doll is the beautiful doll. And these are black kids saying this. And so our kids are perceiving these things very early. And the Pride report goes into some detail about young children. So we as parents have to know this, that somehow, some way, because I think most of us are not deliberately transmitting those kinds of messages, but they're getting those kinds of messages. So from a young age, we have to sort of be conscious at presenting the counter story, the counter narrative. And it's sort of built into our unconscious psyche. And what they call implicit bias is the grown-up version of that. So yeah, it's important to intervene from early.
I
For my boys, depending on where we're at, you know, we travel to visit family in other places where there's a higher Hispanic population, or maybe more Caribbean, you know, it's not a big deal. However, here, and I'm a Pittsburgh native, my husband's from Mexico, here it is very polarizing, the differences. There's different complexions, there's a different look when people see it. We already know, the kids already know, when people see us coming, there's an immediate response. And could you speak to how do you, I don't want to, because of, we talk about race in my family, that's how we grew up. So you know the pros and cons and what to be careful for. My husband, because he's not an American, he's not from America. When you're in Mexico, there's a class system, you're just Mexican. So the race issue, he didn't experience the same, so we're trying to navigate our 9 and 11-year-old boys. I work community corrections, so I'm hyper vigilant and sensitive to protecting them and preparing them, because I know that people are not going to see Felipe and Gabrielle, they're going to see color first. But I don't want it to be where it causes them to be overly sensitive to experience. And we try to be intentionally diverse with our place of faith, school and everything, but they're getting bigger, so their body structure is looking different. And so I'm trying to prepare for the upcoming conversations with dating comes into play and different things like that. Is there anything I could go to or anything you would recommend for interracial children?
Yeah, that's a good question. And let me ask a clarifying question. Are you getting sort of negative experiences from mainstream communities, white communities, or from communities of color, or both?
The day of our election, just the day after the election, our one son was told that he would have to leave the country from some kid. I grew up here, and I know that there were issues, but I never experienced that. And I'm a 70s baby, so it kind of broke my heart to hear my son come home and we have to explain. One, I'm a woman, and I do understand with a father and a brother that as an African American woman, we were middle income. My experience is not the same as my father and my brother went through. And so I just don't know how to navigate it. You know, it feels a little bit more complex than I was.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think,
Sorry.
no, it's okay. I mean, we have to grapple with it. Multiracial children have challenges. You know, that's what we see in the data. You know, that it can be a little tougher for them to find that happy community. But my first advice is, you know, do what you're doing, I'm sure, and just love them as much as you can. And help them when they have the tough days, and find positive peer communities where they feel like they can be themselves and be accepted, and make those things like the great exception rather than their common experiences. And so those kind of emotionally safe spaces are going to be the most valuable thing that you can provide. And there's no clear-cut path to like racial socialization for them. They're going to have to find their own way. I would definitely educate them on multiple histories and celebrate the beauty of being multicultural. And that's a growing group. They're not alone. That's a growing population in the U.S. So that story is going to become increasingly important and increasingly discussed. But I do think that emotional safety and finding good spaces is going to be the most valuable thing right now. Yeah. In the back, and then this gentleman.
Yeah, just a lighter question.
Yep.
You mentioned some movies that your black students dressed in, your white students did not. What are those movies?
Wow. You know, I took the black movie slide out, but I don't know. So I mentioned the 5 heartbeats, love and basketball comes up a lot. Love Jones comes up for people. It's a romance, rated R, so not for kids. I don't know. If you email me, I will email you a list of good black movies. Okay? Mickey's question and then your question.
Tonight, you, on one of your slides, you put some graphs up pertaining to fatherhood or income or incarceration, and you compared Pittsburgh to the United States. And I noticed a perceptible gasp in the audience, because I think they were surprised and, of course, terribly dismayed by that. And I know that you only hit the tip of the iceberg. You didn't talk about the mortality rate of infant mortality rate among blacks. There's so many things. You know, we think we're the city of champions, and yet there is a very huge disparity. And our rank with respect to the wellness of the African American population here is very poor. Why is this message not getting out? Should the university be doing it? Should policy groups be doing it? Should church groups be doing it? Because it's quite a story, and it's Pittsburgh, and it's a Milwaukee story, and I'm wondering why we're not getting that.
It's a good question. I don't know why it's not getting out to mainstream Pittsburgh audiences. I think there's always reticence about bad racial news. That's not something people are just readily looking for or trying to hear. So you kind of have to, there has to be some extra effort to get that stuff out. And people can shut it out. They can shut it off. It's not usually in a space where you can't deny it. And I think, well, a few things. So our center puts out a demographics report every few years, and we did a couple years ago, and you're right, that's like 5 of 100 graphs that we put out about disparities across all ranges of life. And we are stark here in Pittsburgh, and not just relative to the US, but to even other cities. So I think it's a tough message for people that they don't want to always hear, and so it's easy to not hear it unless you're committed to hearing it and committed to knowing it. And so I think that's part of this purpose of this discussion, to be committed to justice, which means to know the injustice. So yeah, great question. I think, you know, it's up to us to try to, you know, be accountable for that.
My question I completely forgot. Sorry, I have 3 under 3, and my youngest is 2 months old, so I apologize. I can't hold on to a thought more than like 5 seconds. I guess everybody in the room can relate. But I just wanted to speak to whoever was asking about positive movies or positive television shows. I wanted to ask you what your opinion of Baz Luhrmann's new series on Netflix, The Get Down. Would you classify that as positive or negative?
That's an interesting one. We're only like 3 or 4 episodes in. So I would say we enjoy it. And it's one that I've seen a lot of like controversy over, but I feel like that one is, we try not to take it too seriously. It's kind of like a hip-hop piece, West Side Story kind of a series, and I haven't seen it all, so I can't say, but it's set in, late 70s, it's sort of pseudo, the story of the origin of hip-hop. In 3 or 4 episodes, it doesn't to me feel like I want to boycott it for any content purposes. It doesn't feel like an educational tool necessarily either. It's kind of just a fun show. And I would say it hasn't like piqued my radars as far as avoiding it. But yeah, so it just seems just like a fun show to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my other thing, sorry, because I'm not going to be able to hang on to it for more than 2 more seconds, but are you aware of Pittsburgh's involvement in the DOJ program called the National Initiative?
I don't know. I don't think I do.
Okay. I'm going to screw this up, so help me, friends, okay, who were there for this. But the DOJ, in response to a lot of, well, not a lot, into in response to all the shootings of African Americans that have been happening all over the country, and it got to a point where it seemed like there were 2 a day for a while this summer, I didn't know this until recently, but Eric Holder, the head of the Department of Justice, in concert with a number of other political and activist groups, developed a curricula that they had, basically the United States, just nationwide, different police forces compete to be a part of a training and curriculum that they developed. And it's called the National Initiative. If you look it up on your phone.
It's National Initiative for Really Dress.
Yes, the National Initiative. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Anyway, they wanted to have 6 cities nationwide participate in this, but it was a competition. There had to be buy-in at a local government level. There had to be buy-in from the police force and the police chiefs. And like I said, it was a competition, and Pittsburgh is one of the cities that won. And so there is a huge effort on their part, and I don't know why this isn't being talked about. I have not read about this. I hadn't heard about this until a recent meeting with the Zone 5 commander. His name is Jason Lando. So he's somebody maybe to link up with for people who are interested in that. But they have, it's a 3-phase training, and they have rolled out the first 2 phases here in Pittsburgh. The 3rd phase will be getting rolled out in January. But what the whole programming is about, if you look it up, you'll get a better description than what I can tell you. But it's about working with the police force to retrain themselves on how to deal with their intrinsic and implicit bias. Because in the police academy nationwide, there is only, he said, approximately 3 hours spent on that, knowing that they're going to be working and policing an incredibly diverse community. And so the fact that Pittsburgh won this and that they are rolling it out, the training also involves de-escalation tactics. I would encourage you to look it up and to reach out to the Zone 5 commander and see how you can get involved, because the work that they're doing is really quite amazing. And he is 100% open and wanting people to come alongside them.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Well, I'm going to say 2 more movies. You know, there's a movie called The Best Man. They made a Best Man holiday that came out like 2 or 3 years ago. That's okay, but the original's better. So go rent The Best Man. And very similar in that vein is another one called The Wood. The Wood is a comedy. And these are just, Best Man's kind of a romantic comedy, and The Wood's kind of a romantic comedy. So very mainstream, very enjoyable. Thank you.